I'm Alan Pisarski. Most of you are familiar with Commuting in America 1, 2, and 3, and as somebody said, I'm going to keep doing it till I get it right. The only other item of self-introduction I'll say is a couple of years ago at the end of the previous century, I was named one of the top 100 people in transportation in the 20th century by the Road and Transportation Builders. And one of my dear friends, nothing like friends, said, he was really impressed by that because he knew that most of my really good work had been done in the 19th century. So anyway, you go on. Let's jump into this. I want to talk about goals here a little bit. Today in transportation, I think we really do have great goals, making things get worse slower. And I think that's what Gabriel said in his opening comments. I like to assert that people travel for rational reasons, that trips have social and economic value to people, and so much of what you hear in planning today about goals is that if everybody would just stay home, we'd meet our transportation goals, and if that's the way you're thinking about goals, you probably need to rethink your goals. It is just not okay for transportation to fail. We are a nation built on mobility. Overcoming the tyranny of distance has been one of the great successes of American society, but we need that mobility to continue to meet our economic goals. This is my statement of my goal for transportation, to reduce the effects of distance as an inhibiting force in our society's ability to realize its economic and social aspirations. And I keep coming back to that and use that kind of as a test of where we're going. This is my perspective on what happens when demand exceeds capacity. I don't know where this, probably China, but it so well fits our present situation. What is congestion? That's what they've asked me to talk about. To me, congestion is people with the economic means to act on their social and economic interests getting in the way of other people with the means to act on theirs. I think that's kind of an economist's definition of what congestion is all about. The great loss is not Tom wanted me to talk about this 3 minutes that I lost in the census data. It isn't really the fact that people get home 3 minutes later that matters so much in congestion. It's the decline in the market shed for jobs, the market sheds for housing, the market sheds for suppliers. It's that whole set of things that I think creates great injury in our economy and in our society. The big thing these days in Washington, we have two commissions playing. We have the Congress. Everybody's focused on finance, which I'll talk about in the next session, but they all agree that you can't talk finance, you can't sell, we don't have any money unless you have something to sell, tell the public what you're going to get for that. We need a vision. And so we've been having visioning conferences galore, and the Congress invited me in to talk about vision, and these were my three main points. The first one is replacing the baby boomers and the skilled workers, and we're going to have too few commuters rather than too many. Expanding metro areas and these immense market sheds that we're going to need in order to get those workers together. And then finally, my definition of a vision was provide the transportation system for America for a society in which the average value of time is $50 an hour. Roughly three times what it is today, and where the average value of goods is approximately 3 times what it is today. So I've been doing a lot of work in that area. One measure of this is this chart. The red counties, this is National County Map, the red counties are those counties that ship more than 25% of their workers outside the county boundaries. Obviously affected by the size of counties, but if you noticed take a look at the Virginia, Maryland area, that's what leads the nation. The average Virginia, Maryland is 50% of the people leave their home county to work. I think a really rather dramatic measure. And if you look at this in time series, you can see the impact of it. Is this a bad thing or a good thing? I mean, obviously you can get all excited about sprawl. You can get excited about long distance commutes, about fuel use. But to me, I see it much more in terms of economic integration, access to larger market sheds of potential employees, the ability of people to access the employment levels that they want. This slide is a little bit too long, but fundamentally, let me just say that what it says is that we will be an affluent society in the future, and the increasing value of people's time and goods is going to make for the opportunity where people will demand, and this is where I very much agree with both Gabe and Sam, where both passengers and freight will demand and be able to pay for high-quality, reliable, amenity-based, personalized transportation. And I think we're all going to be competing in the future. Metro areas are going to be competing in the future on those grounds. This is just a quick look at annual trips per thousand, annual trips per household by income. The median in the middle there is the United States, at about 44,000. This is Fairfax County, Virginia, at 88,000. And when I was asked to speak to the city council, I said, well, we can solve the problem by just sliding everybody back down here. They didn't think it was one damn bit funny. But trips get longer as people get richer. More trips are made, and strangely enough, they tend to use the higher level modes. This is something I just did as an experiment to look at the quintiles of high income versus low in the National Consumer Expenditure Survey. I won't go into it here other than the fact that things like intercity travel quadruples when you in effect triple incomes. You can take a look at these slides and do some arithmetic. The interesting thing, Tom, is that local travel away from home, that last thing, includes transit in other cities, and that quadruples. And the people don't recognize, the transit industry has never even recognized that. So what we need is a transportation system that provides the services that not only do not impede this growth in income and this growth in wealth, but maybe actually every once in a while abets it or even enhances it. We don't know if that's going to happen. The competitive environment that I've talked about says that areas of the country will compete for workers based on these amenities, these lifestyle amenities, and good transportation will be one of the amenities upon which they commute. So what I want to get into here briefly in a few minutes left is to talk about three projects that I've been working on that I think really kind of coalesce some of this. My recent experience is, number one, the metropolitan planning process. Is Randall out there? That the MPO process has kind of noticed that there's congestion, but isn't really particularly interested. State DOT's got a lot on their plates and really very busy, sorry. A lot of people see congestion as a wonderful tool to achieve their goals, and in fact, there is a constituency for congestion out there. Texas, Wendell Cox and I worked with Tim Lomax for the Governor's Business Council a couple of years ago and focused on transportation congestion as one of the state's key three issues. And what we looked at basically was the role of transportation in the state's future competitiveness. We've done a number of studies. Atlanta, Wendell and I, and again Tim, did a study for Georgians for Better Transportation, a business group, and then followed that, Tim and I worked for a governor's mandated congestion mitigation task force, main four agencies in the state getting together. And just recently, and you'll be hearing about this, I guess tomorrow, I was part of the audit, a wonderful process where the state auditor in the state of Washington asked us to perform an audit of congestion and audit the state DOT and their capabilities. This came out in the midst of a very contentious bond vote, which you'll hear about, and the question put to us was, what can be done? So I'm going to kind of go through these and look at what I think maybe there are messages, there are common messages here that make sense. The first one is something has to be done. In all of these cases, there was an economic threat. Dell threatened to leave Texas, which scared the legislature and the governor to pieces. Irate citizenry, complaining and politicians losing their jobs. But in every case, the genesis came from outside the system. There was never an instance where the state DOT said, God, congestion's a terrible problem, we have to fix it. They, in fact, are much more defensive about it than offensive. The governor, the legislature, the business community, somebody from outside that process really attacked. Many of the agencies involved were, in fact, rather reluctant participants. Common threads on the institution side, there's no ownership of the problem. Certainly in Washington state, there was no one who was willing to say, I'm responsible for congestion, and if it gets better, I expect to get a hero medal. If it gets worse, hang me. In fact, there were dozens of players. A couple of you from Seattle remember the study that was done on institutional needs, and I think they said 134, or was it 143 institutions and agencies had the ability to checkmate each other in the region on making any kind of a decision. One of the great, and I will say tragic and immensely important issues is the conflict between interstate commerce and metropolitan mobility that's going on in these metropolitan areas. And I think this is a national scale issue, and one I hope that the commissions in town are addressing. I know I've talked to them about it, but you never know what's going to come out of it. The other item is simply zero transparency. The public does not know what's going on. There's no access to the information in any real sense. There's advocacy stuff, there's people selling, but there is no, you don't know what the negative was. You know, well, this is what we want to do. Look how good it is. What about the stuff you rejected over here? Tell me how good was that? And there is no information. There's people versus the system. I think is a very important thing. By the system, I don't mean the government system. I mean the physical system. My highway is so important, and this is one of the arguments I have with Sam and Gabriel. My system is so important that I have to take good care of it. You say, well, whatever happened to the people? Well, that's another problem, but my system's doing great. And I think there's a real focus. You need to focus on how people are doing, not how my system is doing. In Washington State, their clear mandate is to make the system work right, not so good on what's happening with the people. Technically, a lot of this comes down to the planning process. It's really kind of scary. The former Secretary of Washington said that what you really needed to understand the planning process was a cultural anthropologist. And you know, he said it has to be lived to be believed, and I entirely agree with him. There are separate transit and highway worlds. Tom mentioned this last night. Nobody ever looks at anything cross-comparatively there. That would really spoil most of the fun. The economic analysis process is utterly remote from this process. There's a wonderful thing in Washington where we asked them where the benefit cost analysis was done, and they said, well, they select the projects that they want, and then they do a benefit cost analysis of those projects. And I kind of complained about that, and Tim Lomax said, you don't understand. He said, there's this great big flow chart, and somewhere in the flow chart there's a little box that says, disregard benefit cost analysis, and all you're complaining about, the box is in the wrong place, you know? And I guess Tim understands these things better than I do. But there is this extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary disinterest in this. There's a lot of good monitoring going on. The Gray Book that's produced in Washington State is excellent, but it has no relationship to actually evaluating anything. It has nothing based on anything to do with actually planning to do anything. It just kind of tells you, you know, according to our performance measurements, the Titanic sank at exactly 3 minutes after 4. You know, I mean, that's the kind of monitoring they're doing. The new technologies really do lack constituencies. On the finance side, massive disconnect between planning, programming, and finance. I can pick on Washington, but it's true in Georgia. It's true in Texas. In Atlanta, the congestion weight in the decision process, congestion, which the governor said is the most important thing in the state and is an issue. Wendell has said that Atlanta is the fastest growing congestion area in the country, 40% increase in population in a decade. And it comes out to about, congestion is about 11% of the decision process. In the state of Washington, we could never pin them down as to what that proportion was, but it comes out to pretty much the same. It's part of the fourth goal that they use in their lookups. Funding is totally locked in. Washington State is typical of that, but a lot of other states is the same situation. Funding is, because they've gone to bonding issues where they give people a list, laundry list of what we're going to do. When the state said, when the bridge went down in Minneapolis, he said, if the governor says to me, I have to work on that, he said, I've got $1.40. Everything else in the program is already mandated and already locked into what I have to do. Then there's this wonderful term they use in Washington called sub-area equity, which means everybody gets a piece of the action. And so what I think the voters saw through was simply the fact that these are plans only focused on making sure that everybody gets a sufficient piece of the game so that the money so that the money gets spread around and hopefully the votes get spread around. So this is kind of my takeaway here. In Texas, we set a travel time index goal of 121.2, I guess you could say. In Atlanta, 135. In Washington, reduction in congestion within 5 years. Some of the criteria that we've proposed in each of these areas is, number one, hours of delay reduced per dollar invested. Nobody even tends to look at that. Focus on operating costs. What will future operating costs look like? Nobody likes to talk about that. A performance-based program, and fundamentally the measure I use all the time is what share of the problem have I solved for what share of my resources? And I think that's kind of just simple arithmetic, and I heard Tom yesterday saying what 60% of the money here goes to 2% of the ridership. The whole process at this moment is really dysfunctional and fundamentally disinterested in the process. I think the planning process today has become really the problem rather than the solution. I used to think that these people were just a nuisance, but now they've increasingly, I think, become dangerous. The focus and the goals are elsewhere, and it'll get worse. The next round of legislation will be almost certainly turned into a green tea and almost certainly focus on an air quality type approach to carbon. Lack of funds is really just part of it. One of the things I argue for the states is that they've got these 4 roles that they've got to recognize. Part of a national flow, I-5 as Main Street, part of a state flow, part of a regional flow, part of a community activity. These are the scales. They're not optional. You can't decide that I'm going to do one and forget the others. You have to do all of them. And I think this is what scares me in a lot of the planning that's going on. So I really would like to see kind of a new plan for planning. These are some of the goals and the plans that need to be recognized rather than the kind of focus that's now going on. Mostly safety, supporting economic development, assuring security. The word redundancy has totally disappeared from our lexicon. Maintaining mobility and serving populations, low-income populations, and aging populations. These are the kind of skills that MPOs need to have and don't have. I was asked to talk to SCAG, the Los Angeles group, a couple months ago, and I said, I'll know you're serious when the freight economists in the place outnumber the environmental planners. And they have taken that on as almost a goal, I think. We'll see how far they get. Anyway, into the future, the conflict that I see moving into the next legislation will come down to this. Basically, there's a view of the world that's a neighborhood-based view. Think of trip lengths under 2 miles. Everything can be done with bicycles. And then there's a global view that tends to focus on the longer trips, 100 miles. One focuses on freight, more global competitiveness. The other one focuses on community-based things. One is kind of a make it happen. The other is kind of a let it happen. And this is going to, I think, characterize the 2 sides that are contesting as we move into our next round of legislation, which is going to be coming. I'll talk about that a little bit in the next session. It's going to be very, very ugly. I think I can stop there. Did I actually make it, Tom?
You did.
Holy smoke. It's a first. Thank you very much. Questions? Sir.
Alan, you gave a speech recently at Portland State University in Oregon. I watched my videos and I can't stand to actually go down to Portland anymore.
I understand.
I recall your talks being much more kinder and gentler than with all the planner geeks and kind of tough level approach you gave today, especially your phrase planning is essentially part of the problem. I think you were much nicer to them.
Right.
At any point, either off camera or in the room, or did you mention this sort of thing, and did you get any kind of feedback from those folks that they know they're part of the problem, or is it just the usual denial we have in Portland? Not in Portland.
Yeah, right.
Around the country.
Well, yes.
Is there any acknowledgement among MPOs?
Yeah, I think the answer is becoming yes. I think there is a recognition that the planning process is fundamentally the way in which local areas keep their skirts clean with the EPA in order to continue to qualify for money. And so the real question is, you know, do you do anything beyond that? And I guess Randall would argue that the less they do, the better. And so there's a real question I don't quite know how to address. But you're right, I was a little more forthcoming then. Since then, there's a couple of things that happened which came on the order of an epiphany. One, there was a meeting between ASHTO, the state officials, and AMPO, the metropolitan planning groups down in New Orleans. And I came out of that session, you know, that was really the epiphany point where I said, these people are dangerous. This is no longer silly guys. My first jobs were chief of data collection, Wash Cobb, chief of data collection in New York, MPO. But their worlds have changed, and it was Talmudic. I mean, we were sitting around talking about what the definition of is and things like that. And since then, I was invited by AMPO to speak to them. And what you saw today on what the future ought to be like is exactly what I said to them. And I guess I'm at, if there's any benefit of getting old, it's that you can tell the truth and get away with it. And so I said it, and they accepted it. They accepted it. I thought I'd get shot, but a lot of people said, yeah, that's where we are. That's where we're going, and you're right. The next process will be, I think the next thing coming out of the legislation this time will be even worse. Question, sir. Ron.
Alan, I wonder if you might want to comment on just what's happened in Virginia and how this sort of links up with planners. As you know, the latest highway bill that passed through our conservative Republican legislature and allowed for 2 independent taxing authorities that don't have to go to the voters for taxes. Right. One in the Hampton Roads area, one in Northern Virginia. And both of those match very closely and will overlap with and probably share staff with both metropolitan planning organizations. So essentially what you've done in Virginia is you have created metropolitan planning authorities that have the power to tax without having to go to voters. And in fact, let's not be lost on other planning authorities. The planning authority in my community in Fredericksburg, which you know is a fairly tiny place, but still has its own metropolitan planning authority, paid staff, and unelected board, and all that sort of stuff, has already put on the agenda and is hiring a consultant as to how do we get taxing. Now, I mean, for people in this room, this is a rather sinister development because, as you can very well imagine. So I want to talk about see this sort of thing.
Well, yeah, in fact, I've been approached by some of the folks. They wanted me to agree to serve on their technical advisory committee for this new authority, and I said, you know, life is way too short for that kind of stuff. But what I have done is looked at their criteria and what they're going to be incorporating in their thinking in how they go about funding. And it is even more scary than what Atlanta had, and even more scary than what Washington has. It's got words in there that the average American, you know, doesn't even comprehend. You know, kind of like the increasing ambience for decision making ranks for 20%. You know, stuff like that. And so, what I would suggest, that I guess I would hope that this organization would really kind of dedicate itself almost to kind of attacking this planning process and hoping to reform it in some fashion. I sound like I'm shilling for Randall's book. But in fact, I think what we really do need to do is document what's happening particularly with respect to congestion around the country, and the indifference and the disinterest in the states and the MPOs. The states are so busy doing maintenance and trying to figure out where they're going to get the money to pay for the bridges they have to fix. The MPOs are just, you know, in their other world, and we're going to solve this all with land use and holy water. And I think what we really need is a comprehensive look at the nation in the way in which congestion is being addressed at the metropolitan level.
One more, please.
Sure.
Several years ago, I remember a movement toward so-called transportation demand management. Local government pressures to get businesses to organize carpooling and so on for their workers, and penalties assessed if they didn't meet certain targets.
Yeah.
Is this movement still going on?
It's part of the Fed program. It's got a piece of the dollars. Again, it turns into a very politically correct kind of an exercise, and so it's basically traffic engineering for people whose morality you approve of. And what you see now is typically very small efforts run by people who just keep getting enough money to keep them going. It could benefit greatly, but what Gabriel has talked about in terms of, this is an area which is ripe for privatization rather than a public process. And I would think that it would be much stronger if it was handled from that perspective. We are seeing it, by the way, we are seeing it on the private side. Microsoft out in Seattle is actually, they're putting in vans, they're building offices off-site so that people can commute to those sites. So there is a lot more being done as kind of a way to ameliorate the present disaster.